Well, good morning, everybody. If you could come in and try and grab a chair. My name's Brian O'Rourke. I'm the President and Chief Executive Officer of CADTH, and I'd like to welcome all of you today to our portfolio information session on medical devices and clinical interventions. Let me start by acknowledging that the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa lands. So a traditional greeting to all of you. And this is going to be an interesting morning. This morning we'll be doing this session on our medical devices and clinical interventions portfolio. We have a similar session this afternoon for those who have an interest in our pharmaceuticals portfolio. Lots of information we'll share. We'll do some questions throughout the process, and then we'll save a fair bit of time at the end as well, just for an open question and answer period. So the agenda itself that you'll see today, we have Dr. Harindra Vijay-Sundara, who will provide you with an overview of our portfolio, a number of new initiatives that we'll talk about, and some program changes. We would like to speak as well about patient engagement at CADTH and some of the things we're trying to do to enhance that, both for our pharmaceuticals and medical devices program. And as I mentioned, we'll have an open forum for questions throughout the process. We do have people from across Canada, I believe almost every province and territory, as well as some watching us online around the world. I know we have somebody from Kazakhstan who signed in for our session this afternoon. The presenters, as you can see here, Harindra, Leslie, Chris, Andra, and Nicole, various folks from within CADTH. As I've mentioned about the questions, if you are planning to ask a question here in the room, if you can make your way to one of the microphones, mostly for the benefit of our online participants. And we usually like to have you identify who you are and who you're here representing. And for those of you who are online, use the question feature on the live stream toolbar, and then all of the questions will be emailed to me, and we'll likely try and do a bit of a back and forth of online questions and in-room questions. So one of the first things I wanted to mention for the session today is that in case you have not heard or are interested, I have announced my retirement from CADTH, which will be effective on the 31st of March of 2020. So the CADTH Board of Directors has identified a selection committee from members of the board. We've engaged with Boyden, an executive search firm, to begin the process. The board does hope to have somebody in place prior to my departure. And for those of you who might have an interest in this role, it's a fantastic job, so spread the word. It's also an interesting time in Canadian politics with the recent federal election and our minority government with the Liberals. And just last week, the Prime Minister announced the new member of the new health minister for Canada for the federal government. We're eagerly awaiting to see what our new minister is going to be mandated to do with her letter. So once again, there may be some interest from the medical devices companies with the Health and Biosciences Economic Strategy table that was released a year or so ago. But we're all eagerly waiting to see what the priorities will be for the federal government. I wanted to mention a few international initiatives as well. My team will be speaking mostly about CADTH and some of the things that are of interest within Canada. But a lot of what's happening around the world in the HTA field and in the technology field does have an implication for us at CADTH. This is a list of the top 10 items created annually by the Professional Society for Health Economics and Outcomes Research, or ISPOR, is their official acronym. As you can see from the top 5 list, a lot of these are about pharmaceuticals, but they've been gradually shifting as well into the medical devices field. There's the 6 to the 10, so a number of these do apply to medical devices and clinical interventions as well from an HTA perspective. ISPOR does have an HTA council, and on that HTA council, I'm actually the chair of that HTA council and will be continuing with that role even when I retire from CADTH. We have roundtables that are held in various parts of the world, Asia Pacific, in Europe, in North America, in Latin America, and in the Middle East as well. So these roundtables bring together some of the key players within the agencies, the health technology assessment agencies, as well as some academic units from around the world. And increasingly here, we've been trying to expand the talk away from just pharmaceuticals into the medical devices space. So a lot of these items, once again, we do try and bring forward. A lot of other international HTA activities do involve, mostly in the pharmaceutical space, with the exception of INATA, the International Network of Agencies for HTA, roughly 50 agencies from 30 countries around the world. This is a safe space for the agency staff to get together to discuss some of their key issues. One of the things we have done is we've created an international task group to come up with a new definition for health technology assessment. There are about 9 different definitions that have been created over the past 30 years. Most of them are very long, very unmemorable, very complicated to explain to people that don't have a knowledge of what HTA is. So I was, again, co-chairing this international initiative with an individual from the Netherlands, who is a representative from the Health Technology Assessment International. But we've gathered people from all of the different parts of the globe, and I believe we are very close to publicly announcing that new definition for HTA. Much shorter, much more memorable, easily translatable into multiple languages, and we're looking forward to being able to publicly announce that. We're also in all of the parts of the world and people that I've engaged with internationally, real-world evidence is a hot topic in every country. And particularly in the medical devices space, when a lot of the devices are approved with minimal information or evidence at that regulatory level. So there is a real need for real-world evidence assessments and analysis and data around the medical devices space. One of the other things we're really trying to do is to harmonize the HTA component, which typically is engaging the policy people within governments in making good decisions on technologies, with the clinical space, the clinical practice guidelines. So there is a network called Guidelines International Network, GIN, a very interesting name, and HTA. So one of those initiatives, again, that I've been trying to promote internationally with between INATA and GIN, and we've called our working group GIN-NATA, and lots of good efforts happening on bringing together the policy people and the clinical application of the technologies. Health Technology Assessment International is the association or society for anybody who has an interest in HTA, whether you're a sponsor, a manufacturer, a patient, a clinician, academic, student, or somebody from an HTA agency. Lots of interest in this community. They hold an annual conference. In 2020, their conference will be in Beijing. It's become a little bit of a challenge for those of us from Canada to attend the conference. We unfortunately won't be sending anybody from CADTH to the conference for the first time in many years, and a lot of that is related to some of the diplomatic issues between China and Canada currently underway. There is a global policy forum within HTAI, and this policy forum has an equal number of representatives from companies, medical device and pharmaceutical, and HTA agencies, about 17 different manufacturers and 15 to 17 different HTA agencies from around the world. We do get together twice a year usually, and there's a topic that's selected each year for common discussions. And the topic that we've selected, and the meeting will be held at the end of January in New Orleans. You'll hear a little bit more about this when Nicole comes up and talks about deliberative frameworks. But to me, it's one of the most important issues in the HTA community is how do we make the decisions that we make? What are some of the factors that we consider in how our expert bodies or appraisal bodies do their deliberations? So this is one of the first efforts to try and harmonize the type of deliberations that happen at these expert bodies once again globally. The Center for Center for Innovation and Regulatory Sciences, CIRS, they're focused mostly on pharmaceuticals, so I won't go too much into that. ISPOR, as I mentioned, one of the interesting things that ISPOR has done, because they're trying to grow their medical devices work, they have created this interest group on medical devices and really focused in on the value assessment, how HTA agencies and academics do their reviews of medical devices. And then a number of other miscellaneous things happening. One that we're doing with a group in the United States called ICER and NICE in the UK, 3 HTA agencies and CADTH. There is a collaboration underway between our 3 agencies to try and look at some of the health economics assessments that we do, primarily again in the pharmaceutical space, but I would expect that this would also apply in the future to medical devices. So lots of things happening on that international space. So with that, that's the introduction to this morning's activities. I'd now like to call up Dr. Vijay Sundara to give you an overview of our clinical interventions and medical devices portfolio.
Thank you, Brian, and welcome everybody. So I'm going to be relatively brief on my part of the agenda. My goal is to really provide an overview of the products that we currently offer. For many of you, this will be a review from last year, and for some of you, this may be new. I'm going to emphasize some of the changes that we said we were planning to do last year, and much of these talks by other members of my team will be on how we've operationalized some of those changes. The second part will be really focused on a couple of key questions. How do we ask the right questions? Examples of how we've tried to answer it, how we've tried to get appropriate feedback from stakeholders, patients specifically, and finally how we kind of put that all together to make decisions and the quality of our decision making. And the underlying theme that I hope you see through all of that is that the medical devices and the clinical intervention space, as all of you know, is very complex. And one size certainly does not fit all. And this morning will be really, the underlying theme of it is our effort to try to confront that reality. And its intent is to provide you that information, but also we'll have lots of time, as Brian mentioned, to really kind of get your feedback, in which we really earnestly and sincerely want to hear. So with that, these are the current products that we have in the medical devices and clinical intervention space. So there's the rapid response service, the health technology assessments, optimal use, environmental scans, and horizon scans. When thinking about those products, they really, it's good to conceptualize them across this spectrum of things that are accelerated, the questions that need to be answered quickly, and those that need additional analyses. And the balance between those is, of course, timeliness and comprehensiveness. So our rapid response service is meant to be just that, rapid, to answer questions that can be answered in a short period of time. Within that product line, we do have a number of different categories, so something as simple as a reference list all the way to a systematic review and meta-analysis. We do a lot of these. We do about 300, depending on the day. We project sometimes to do far more than that, so there is a lot of interest and a lot of questions in the healthcare system that we do try to answer. Our customers are generally really anybody within the healthcare system, so it's typically from the federal government and the provincial and territorial governments. It can be from regional health authorities or hospitals. Areas that we've looked into as additional people who've asked of the rapid response service has been professional societies, and this aligns with what Brian mentioned about our connection with guidelines. So using the rapid response service and our expertise in evidence synthesis to provide that type of evidence synthesis to professional societies as they're putting together position statements and guidelines. And finally, we have, over the years, provided evidence synthesis to choosing wisely. When we move from that rapid, quick assessments to those that require something more comprehensive, in the medical devices space, that can be quite broad. And so this in general are the different categories that we may include in a health technology assessment. So an effectiveness review, an economic analysis, ethics, patient perspectives and experiences. We have tried to expand that as we've encountered new technologies that do require a legal lens to it. Implementation concerns are often and increasingly the largest focus of our reviews, because many of the technologies that come through are complex and have meaningful transformations of healthcare delivery in order for them to actually be implemented. And so we put a lot of effort into trying to do that. Environmental impact has been a very kind of a newer area that we're recognizing that some of these new technologies do have environmental impacts, and we do have to be cognizant of that, although that sometimes falls outside of the health sector. When we're making our recommendations, we want to make sure that it aligns with Canada's other responsibilities on the environmental front. All of these different categories doesn't mean that we include all of them within our health technology assessments, and then the second part of our presentation will try to give you a sense of how we decide which ones to include and which ones we can safely not. Our optimal use are essentially HTAs that go to our expert panel and come with recommendations. Those recommendations can inform appropriate use. They can be targeted towards policy or practice decisions. And as mentioned, they're done by our expert committee called HTERP. The second part of that is we feel very strongly, and as we've moved to health technology management, we don't want to end with our recommendations. It is not our intent to have evidence synthesis and then a recommendation that sits on our webpage, but rather that knowledge mobilization and implementation of those recommendations is a key part of our work. Horizon scanning has been one of our signature areas. We're somewhat unique within the Canadian context that we do have a dedicated arm to horizon scanning. We've tried to build on that success over the last few years, and at last year's session you would have heard that we were trying to look at what worked in it and how we can further refine it. And that refinement has happened and has now been implemented. So we put a lot of thought into what was the purpose of horizon scanning. Who were we talking to? What was our audience? And in fact, there are quite a few different audiences, and we now have 4 different product lines within horizon scanning to try to address that. One is to really inform HTA development. That's a good horizon scanning program. Some of those horizon scans should lead to full HTAs, and if those two are completely separate, then that disconnect is not appropriate. Some of it is purely to inform preparedness, and that preparedness can be on the part of policymakers, clinicians, but also us as HTA producers. When we truly have something that's transformative that is coming down the pipeline, it may be transformative to the healthcare system, but it may also be transformative and challenging the actual ways that we do HTAs. And we're going to talk about digital health because that is an example of a technology that we know will be transformative, but it will actually challenge the actual manner in which we do evaluations. Finally, overviews of an entire area such as AI and early assessments, things that aren't probably going to hit the road very soon, but nonetheless are important to have awareness of. And finally, our environmental scanning, which are often standalone reports or could be linked to an HTA. Oftentimes, the first question to ask before you do a full HTA is, what is the status quo? And that's what environmental scanning does. It provides that snapshot, and we have a number of different approaches to it that we've tried to become increasingly sophisticated in, literature reviews, but actually surveys, and making use of our kind of vast network of implementation officers across the country to make use of them to consult with people on the ground. The newer initiatives, which we mentioned last year, which a lot of today will be to show what we've done in those areas, is this idea of a tailored custom HTA. That the term HTA we want to evolve to mean broadly anything that will inform clinical practice or policy, and you'll see how we've tried to accomplish that. the horizon scanning expansion that we've done, we've really put a lot of emphasis into collaborative projects. There are a lot of HTA bodies in this country. In fact, we did an environmental scan that shows there are 43. So there is a lot of capacity for this type of work in the country, and it's important that that capacity be efficient so that we're not duplicating each other's work and that we can learn from each other. And the Pan-Canadian HTA Collaborative has been a group that we've provided secretariat responsibility to, and certainly one of our key initiatives. And finally, condition level reviews. And we'll talk about that in some depth. The idea here is that the divide between medical devices and pharmaceuticals is artificial. Most things in medicine involve both. And to simply evaluate something with blinders on about all the possible therapies that are involved and the potential diagnoses and diagnostic tools involved sometimes does not provide the type of insight that both policymakers need and clinicians need. And so condition level reviews is our attempt to try to confront that reality. So with that, maybe we'll talk about the different initiatives and then take questions. Is that okay, Brian?
So one of the initiatives or objectives for the current CADTH strategic plan is about adopting a life cycle approach. And specifically, one of those initiatives is about developing an assessment process for care pathways. And when we're talking about care pathways, as Harinder mentioned, a care pathway is intended to inform a decision about all of the aspects of a particular condition rather than a single technology. And in this case, technologies would span both the drug and devices portfolios. So this could incorporate prevention, screening, diagnosis, treatment, follow-up, spanning both drugs and medical devices and clinical interventions. So this is a new product for CADTH, the condition level reviews, but they will incorporate a lot of existing products that CADTH already has. So these will be tailored custom products that will look at assessments of the condition and the aspects of the condition that we are looking to review. So the methods that would go into a condition level review in the various products would vary depending on the topic. And this could include de novo systematic reviews, where CADTH would go do their own work to do an assessment on the technology for the particular aspect of the condition. We could also, though, update an existing systematic review, and this could be an existing systematic review that has been conducted by CADTH or one of an external organization. And if an existing systematic review is considered to be up to date and is recent enough, then we could broker that existing systematic review and don't do any update at all. And we could use our rapid response program to fill in any gaps in the evidence that might exist for any one of those components for any one of the technologies. Condition level reviews will also incorporate new products, though. This will be a lot of information coming from a lot of different product types and reports that will all need to be brought together into one summary. So there will be a summary document that will collate all of the information on the specific condition and from prevention to follow up for that condition. And then if required, based on customer needs, if we need to contextualize some of that information for our specific jurisdictions and customers, then we'll be able to work with our implementation support team and knowledge mobilization team to do that. So when we were looking at setting up the process for condition level reviews, we worked closely with our implementation support and knowledge mobilization team to come up with topics that would be appropriate to move forward for a condition level review. So we looked at topics that were current priorities within the jurisdictions, and there were emerging issues with these conditions. We also looked at conditions that had multiple dimensions. So there were questions about treatment, questions about diagnosis. So they were multifaceted, and they also incorporated more than one treatment option and would span both drug and device portfolios. So we looked at the state of the literature for some conditions and determined feasibility for moving forward with a condition level review. There were 4 topics that were brought forward as potentially appropriate to move forward for CADTH's first condition level review. I'll go into a little bit of detail of each one of those. Concussion was put forward as a possible option for a condition level review because there are a high number of diagnosed concussions. There is the presence of persistent symptoms. So with the addition of symptoms in the immediate phase, there's also persistent symptoms and different treatments that might be relevant for those different phases. They span the drug and non-drug portfolios. And there are some questions about diagnosis as well. So concussion was the first option, and C. difficile infection was put forward as a second potential option. It is a common cause of infectious diarrhea in hospital patients. There are differences in coverage for the different treatments for C. difficile, and there are some emerging treatments as well. So with some of the new updates and the changing landscape, this was a potential topic for a condition level review. The third one was Lyme disease. There is increasing incidence of Lyme disease, and it's moving across the country. There are a lot of questions about appropriate diagnosis or accurate diagnosis of Lyme disease. The guidelines may be a little bit unclear, and there's multiple guidelines that perhaps aren't aligned. There's variability in the treatments and follow-up for people with Lyme disease. So because of the uncertainty with treatment and diagnosis of Lyme disease, this was a possible topic as well. And then finally, tuberculosis was raised as another possible topic. There are a lot of questions about diagnosis of TB as well as treatment of TB. There's drug-resistant TB, there's latent TB, and a lot of different questions that surround diagnosis and treatment of those different types of tuberculosis. Some questions about how to identify patients who may be at high risk for tuberculosis, who maybe should go on for screening and treatment. And then differences in questions about optimal treatment regimens, and there are some new treatment options as well for tuberculosis. So we have chosen tuberculosis to move forward as CADTH's first condition level review. There is work ongoing, though, on all of the other topics as well. So with the TB condition level review, this is still in early phases of scoping. We're working closely with our implementation team to conduct focus groups to talk to the customers about what the needs really are for this review and where the gaps might be that CADTH could support. So we're in the process of compiling existing evidence, holding those focus groups, and setting our plan to move forward with this condition level review. For the other three topics that aren't moving on forward for a full condition level review yet, Lyme disease, we actually have a translation underway of work that has been conducted by INES that does cover diagnosis and treatment, which will meet the needs of CADTH customers, and that translation is underway. For C. difficile, we're currently doing an environmental scan to look at different aspects of fecal microbiota transplant. And for concussion, we're doing some early scoping on a new emerging diagnostic test for concussion. We also have a number of new topics that we're looking at for potential future condition level reviews. These are very broad topics, so we're going to be taking our time to do the scoping on these to determine what will be moving forward next for condition level reviews. And now I'll turn it over to Andra, who's going to talk about their medical imaging program.
That was Leslie Dunfield, by the way, in case you were wondering, and Andra Morrison from our medical devices section as well.
Hi, so thank you. So today I'll be talking briefly about the Canadian Medical Imaging Inventory. Sorry, I don't know how to change the slide.
Green button and then big green.
This one?
No, this big one here.
Oh, thank you. I'll be discussing the Canadian Medical Imaging Inventory, which is a national web-based survey. So what I'll be doing is I'll be discussing what it's about, so its purpose, its coverage and its uses, and I'll also be talking a little bit about the next steps. So what's new, when we'll publish the next report, and also a pilot service. So what is the Canadian Medical Imaging Inventory? It is a national web-based survey that's conducted once every 2 years, and it collects data from public and private healthcare facilities across Canada. We look at 6 imaging modalities, so that's CT, that's MRI, SPECT and SPECT-CT, and the PET hybrids. We collect information in 3 broad categories of data. So that's access data, looking at the number, location, and location of imaging modalities and cyclotrons. We look at usage data, so the hours of use of this data and how it is being used. And finally, we look at the technical characteristics of data. So really looking at the characteristics of specific imaging modalities and access to PACS. I should mention this is the most comprehensive data collected on a national level. So what is the purpose of the Canadian Medical Imaging Inventory? So at the highest possible level, it is intended to guide strategic planning and thinking. And in this capacity, our work is used for capital planning purposes and also for equipment replacement strategies. It's also used to identify gaps in service because we know exactly where equipment is placed. It informs appropriate use of imaging. Now, we know that appropriate use in imaging is a complex and multifaceted issue, but we do collect pockets of data that are intended to help shed some light on what those issues may be. We also collect data to anticipate future demands. We track trends over time, and we're going to be predicting future demands in terms of units and exams. Our work is used to inform purchasing decisions, particularly the data we collect on the age of equipment. It is used to encourage collaboration, so we're connected to decision makers at every level of the healthcare system, and we use this opportunity to link people across these different areas and provinces and territories. And finally, our work informs HTA agendas. So the first broad category of data is access data. So this pertains to the number and the location of imaging equipment. So this provides a pan-Canadian view of access and also provides some insight into the influence of geography and demographics. This particular image here depicts the placement of CT. It's the only imaging modality in Canada that is available at this time in every province and territory. So what are the uses of this data? There are 5 main uses that have been reported to us by decision makers. And this includes identifying underserved locations and gaps in service, informing the appropriate deployment of new equipment to help reduce bottlenecks that may impede access to other medical specialists in the healthcare service, informing implementation strategies aimed at waitlist reductions, facilitating a personalized approach to patient care to optimize based on the patient's proximity to optimal imaging equipment, and also to help planning for contingency care. And in this capacity, we're really thinking about when equipment breaks down or when there are particular shortages, such as with medical isotopes. This access data also allows us to compare our performance with other OECD countries. So in this diagram here, for example, that you can see in 2017, with regards to the number of MRI units per million people, Canada ranked in the lower middle in between Turkey and Chile. This access data allows us to monitor trends, to monitor the adoption of advanced imaging equipment, and indeed its disinvestment. So in the last report, we added a new area that compared the number of exams and the number of equipment over a 10-year period. And what we noted is that for SPEC CT, it grew by over 600% in that time period, while maybe not surprisingly, SPECT decreased in growth over that time period by about 50%. This data also gives us an opportunity to track the integration of support tools. So, for example, we ask our survey responders to report whether they use artificial intelligence and if they're using it in a clinical and/or research setting. We also look at computerized decision support systems, centralized ordering practices, peer review programs, etc. And finally, we forecast future demand. So in the new reports, we'll be looking at, for each of these imaging modalities, we'll be looking at projections over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and we'll be doing that at a national level, provincially, and we may even have a capacity to do it at a more local level. So the next broad category of data we collect information on is usage data. Here we look at the hours of use. So at the facility level for each imaging modality, which modalities are used for 24 hours and which have weekend services. We also look at the hours a day and the hours per week this imaging equipment is in use, plus planned downtimes. On the exam front, we look at the number of exams that are conducted at the facility level for each one of these imaging equipments, the type of exams by broad disease categories, and whether they're used for diagnostic or interventional purposes or clinical research purposes, and if they're used for radiation therapy treatment planning and tracking. The main uses of this data is used to support system efficiencies, and it does this by identifying overburdened equipment that may require more maintenance or replacement, by identifying underburdened equipment that can help reduce wait lists by diverting patients to underused sites, and identifying factors that may contribute to workflow efficiencies and process improvement strategies. Also, this usage data allows us to provide insight on appropriate use, so how equipment is used, who can order exams, and broad exam ordering practices. The last category of data we collect information on is technical data. So here we're looking at the equipment age, its make and model, plans for new installations, decommissionings and replacements, mobile units and the sites that they serve, the use of appropriateness criteria, safety features, particularly those relating to radiation, and also modality-specific characteristics, such as field strength for MRI and number of slices for CT. The main uses of this technical data is to report on the age of equipment. So this is important because the equipment might need to be replaced, upgraded, or refurbished in accordance with the Canadian Association of Radiologists guidelines. There may also be equipment, the range of potential life expectancies of equipment, and also provides insight into inequality to access to imaging equipment. As well, having information on technical data can help to locate specialized equipment. So, for example, wide-bore MRIs for large and claustrophobic patients. This data can also be used for the uptake of radiation dose reduction tools. So we don't just report on which imaging equipment has dose reduction tools, but whether it's actually being used, and often there's a discrepancy between the two. And this data also gives us insight into purchasing trends. So finally, the next steps, we're in the process of collecting data for our next report, and we plan to release that in the fall of next year. Once we finish that work, we're going to be embarking on new work in the imaging front, and this is imaging in the rural and remote communities. We'll be consulting with our customers and our stakeholders to determine the parameters of that work. And finally, we're going to be piloting a service. And this service will be launched at the same time as the next report. So since publishing the 2018 report, we received many requests for information. So what we plan to do now is to pilot this service and to reach out to our customers to let them know that the report itself is the tip of the iceberg, but below that there's a complex matrix of data that can be used, and we want to encourage people not just to use it, but show them how it can be used. Thank you.
Thank you, Andra. And now we'll have Chris Camel. Chris is going to be talking to us about digital health, artificial intelligence, etc. Very interesting topic.
Thanks, Brian. So as Brian mentioned, I'll be talking about some work that we have been undertaking in the realm of digital health. And so the first question we might ask is, why digital health? And so this is an area that has a lot of new and emerging technologies. I flew in from Ottawa this morning. In the airport, I saw 2 ads for different artificial intelligence type services, and the In-Flight magazine had an advertisement for an internet-based mental health intervention. So these are technologies that are already here, and it, as Andrew pointed out, increasingly our traditional health technologies or medical devices are coming online and integrating a digital component. So really everything is becoming digital now, or maybe not everything, but most things. And so that makes it a really important area for CADTH to be devoting some thought and some resources. But those technologies are quite challenging to evaluate. They bring new dimensions to our traditional health technology assessment that we have to be thoughtful about, and I'll talk in a bit more detail about those challenges. And one of those challenges is that they have the potential to impact across conditions. So if you think, for example, of a telehealth type intervention, that's not really telehealth for one thing, that's telehealth for everything, and the systems that are put in place can be used across conditions, and that makes evaluation a bit challenging. but they do have the potential to improve care and improve access to healthcare outside of the traditional setting. So one of the key features of many digital health interventions is that the point of care is no longer a clinic or a lab. The point of care is the patient. And I'm sure I would be willing to wager that almost everybody in this room has a device on them that can perform some function or serve as a portal to healthcare. So one of the main challenges of digital health is defining digital health. So what is it? There are a number of different definitions that are floating around that have been developed by different groups. Some have defined digital health as a cultural transformation. And so what that means is that it's more than just technological advancements. It's really about the change in the way care is delivered. So I mentioned that now the patient is the point of care, but it also has the potential to change that patient-physician relationship. It does that by increasing the use of data to empower both patients and clinicians, and really enhance the shared decision-making that a patient can undertake with their physician, because they now hold some of their own data depending on the nature of that intervention. It also offers new options for the prevention, diagnosis, and management of conditions. So again, this is changing the point of care. This is offering the ability to receive care when you want, how you want, rather than being reliant on when a care provider is available to you. And so none of these really quite define what digital health is, and there are some groups that are trying to define what digital health isn't, and what they've proposed is something called the Gary rule. And so how they define it is if your health problem, or if your problem in the healthcare setting, it can be solved by Gary from IT, then that's a health IT problem. But if it requires multiple people from multiple facets of care, then that's a digital healthcare problem. It still doesn't quite tell you what it is. So functionally, the way we think about digital health is it includes mobile health, so that can include apps on your phone. It includes wearables, such as your Fitbits potentially, or other remote monitoring type devices. Telehealth and telemedicine, and then sort of collectively using that data to promote personalized healthcare. It includes things like artificial intelligence to provide clinical decision support. And then some groups also include things like 3D printing. So 3D printing either to enhance drug discovery or to actually print physical components such as joint replacements. So digital health isn't something that is new to CADTH. We have done quite a bit of work in this space already, so I'm just going to walk through a few examples. So if you go to the CADTH website, under our evidence bundles that have been helpfully put together by our knowledge mobilization team, you can find an evidence bundle related to rural and remote health. And under that, you can find all the work that we've done on telehealth and telemedicine. So that's an area that we've already done a considerable amount of work through our rapid response program and through other programs. We recently completed an optimal use report on internet-delivered cognitive behavioral therapy for major depressive disorder and anxiety disorders. And if you'd like to learn more about that particular project, I believe we're giving a webinar this week on November 27th that you can tune in and hear about this work that was done jointly with Health Quality Ontario. We also have a second project underway currently on internet-delivered cognitive behavioral therapy, in this case for PTSD, and those recommendations are currently out for stakeholder feedback. So if you have an interest in that area, you can go to our website and provide feedback on the draft recommendations. And as mentioned at the beginning of the session, we've done a fair bit of work also in our horizon scanning. And so we've done some work related to clinical applications of artificial intelligence. So this was an overview to provide sort of what are the different ways that artificial intelligence can be integrated into healthcare, spanning from public health interventions to mental health and beyond. And we've also done some horizon scanning work looking very early at some existing technologies, also using artificial intelligence to enable their usability. So what are some of the challenges? So first of all, there's a question of what to assess. So by one estimate, there are up to 300,000 different health apps available. And obviously any one organization doesn't have the capacity to do that volume of work. There are also challenges with regards to what the platform that these apps or other digital health technologies are available on. So you could imagine, for example, an app that uses the camera on your phone to help diagnose melanoma, for example. Now, does that technology differ if it's on my iPhone 6 than my new iPhone 11? Does it differ if I use a Google Pixel, which maybe has a better camera? And so these are sort of the complicating things, like which platform do we evaluate, and subsequent to that, when do we evaluate? So one way that we can think about this is taking a sort of a function-based or a risk-based approach. So among those 300,000 health apps, there are apps that might provide some specific type of care that's meant to change a health outcome. But there are others, for example, in some libraries that are a timer to help you with your toothbrushing and make sure that you're doing it for the full 2 minutes. So something like that, a toothbrush timer, probably doesn't need the type of assessment that something that's intended to affect your actual health more directly might require. It might not require an evaluation at all. It's a timer. And so thinking about what the claims of a technology are and what its intended effect is will help us decide which technologies rise to the top in terms of importance of what needs to be evaluated. Now, there are some other challenges there in that, for example, if you have a heart rate monitor that's used just for healthy lifestyle and monitoring your exercise, it doesn't take much for that technology to then become a different type of monitor for a different purpose, for example, detecting atrial fibrillation. And if that, so there's just the potential for unintended use of existing technologies for specific purposes. So again, identifying what those are and what needs to be assessed can pose a challenge. There's also the question about when to assess. So we often talk in the medical device space about fast development cycles for medical devices. This is even more so for software development. So short development times or frequent updates of software means we have to be very vigilant about when a software changes the effectiveness of a technology, and that might be a trigger for a reevaluation. It becomes even more complicated when we're dealing with things like machine learning, where the software is constantly improving itself, and there's no defined version 2.0 for us to look at with an upgrade. So this sort of ties into what we talked about a little bit, which is a life cycle approach to health technology assessment. And we are developing some tools and looking at ways that we can do this sort of more continuous evaluation with things like living systematic reviews, and this is being developed in conjunction with our evidence standards team. And then perhaps the biggest challenge is how do we assess? So there are different types or sources of evidence that might not be the same as what we're used to looking at when we're looking for randomized controlled trials. So our traditional PubMed database search might not be sufficient. We might have to broaden and look to tech journals or accept different types of evidence that aren't randomized controlled trials. We might not even be looking at trial type evidence at all, and it's evaluating software and how it performs, which is a bit out of our traditional skill set as HTA producers. Additionally, there's an increased focus on elements outside of the traditional clinical and cost effectiveness and the other elements that Harinder mentioned. And we're now talking about things like privacy and data security and data ownership and the ethical issues that come with that. So these are additional components that we need to think about. There's user interface and usability. And interoperability, so how well does this one piece of equipment or one app or one digital health technology integrate with existing health systems as well? And so these are all things that are at the forefront of our minds. I won't say we have solutions to many, if any of them yet, but it's something that we are working on and thinking about in conjunction with other people who share the same challenges and the same concerns. So these are some ongoing collaborations that we have. First of all, with Health Canada. So CADTH has been very engaged with Health Canada on a number of fronts with regards to digital health technologies. So we have been a member of a scientific advisory panel on software as a medical device, helping provide input to guidance for, and how the regulations, or the regulatory aspect might need to be handled for those. We've also been engaged with them on a scientific advisory committee on digital health technologies, and this is a committee that is a standing committee looking at those various aspects that I mentioned. So we've held a couple of meetings so far, one on cybersecurity, one on artificial intelligence, with more to come. Again, thinking through those issues and what might be required from both a regulatory and an HTA aspect for evaluation. We've also been informally engaged with Health Canada, thinking through some specific technologies, having discussions around 3D printing, intending to meet at some point in the future to walk through an example of a 3D printed technology to see where our respective processes break down. And I think that's really how we're going to sort of identify some of the issues that we might have as we continue to assess digital health technologies, is to develop test cases, walk through them, and find out where our current processes and our current methods are insufficient for the task. We're also engaged with work with the Mental Health Commission of Canada. So this is an ongoing environmental scan and literature review related to artificial intelligence for mental health conditions. And really the purpose of this work is to sort of identify the landscape. So who are the players in the space? What technologies exist? What are the trends and where do we expect those technologies to go? As well as a bit of early evaluation of what existing technologies are. And so that's work that is currently underway that we expect to complete by the end of the calendar year. And we've been engaged similarly with Canada Health InfoWay. And so this is a collaboration where we're leveraging CADTH's experience with clinical evidence review and InfoWay's experience with that interconnectivity and the sort of the digital IT aspect of it. And what we're hoping to do, currently we're looking at different frameworks for the evaluation of mobile apps. We're focused on mental health because we know that's an area where there is a receptor, but we're hopeful that whatever we develop as a framework for proceeding with the evaluation of apps will be applicable beyond mental health. And so we've been engaged with conversations with each other, with other Canadian stakeholders, as well as international bodies who are also undertaking this work, such as the NHS, thinking about what considerations need to be made when we're evaluating an app. And our next step, once we've decided or we've figured out what those components are, is to develop a list of a small number of apps, again, so we can test our process and discover where we maybe need to develop a little bit more. So over the coming weeks and months, you can expect to see more of us in the digital health space, including some outputs from these collaborations, as well as ongoing assessments of technologies. And so I will stop there, and I think we have time for questions now on all three sessions that you've just heard.
Yeah, so we'll take a bit of a pause. We're still here looking for questions on clarification mostly. We will have about 30 minutes at the end of the session for open questions. But any questions that you might have on our condition level reviews, on our medical imaging inventory and digital health artificial intelligence, or any of what Harindra had talked about. So let me pause here just for a minute, see if we got anything online as well. And I had mentioned the new health minister, but we've also, when they announced the cabinet last week, Navdeep Bains staying in his portfolio. However, name change again for that ministry, Innovation, Science and Industry. So we're also looking to see what might be in his mandate letter. Doesn't seem to be any questions coming in online, so well done, guys. Very clear. So let's move on. We'll now start talking about some of our program changes in the portfolio. Back to Harindra.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about getting the question right. And I would say over my time at CADTH, which now I've been here for almost 3 years, this has really been in the medical device and clinical intervention space where we have put the most effort under Leslie's leadership of trying to change the manner in which we are deciding on topics and how we are getting the right question. So perhaps it's obvious to ask why we need to get that right. For us, there's really two reasons. One is timeliness. We do feel that it's critically important in the medical devices and clinical intervention space that the answers we provide are timely. And that has been a shortcoming of HTA in general, both for us as an organization, but HTA as an entity, that it takes a long time to be very comprehensive and decisions have to be made in the system. And when you don't have that right balance, you end up with a very comprehensive recommendation that unfortunately is no longer relevant because the decision has been made or that the system itself has adapted organically. For us, it is often the case that the relevant problem is not always should it be adopted. So in contrast to the pharmaceutical space, oftentimes the relevant question is, should this be adopted within a formulary? For us, even when the question is, should it be adopted, it's oftentimes not clear by who, for whom, and who is actually going to pay for this. And so in that context, we felt that it was very important to try to have a process where we are really refining that question so that we can determine what components of our deliberative frameworks are the ones that are going to drive the answer to that question so that we can have a more focused, tailored HTA that can be done in a timely fashion. So this is a very kind of basic overview of how we come up with questions. So we have a long list, and there are multiple inputs into that long list. Some of them are proactive, are program development officers, scour the literature, they look at conferences, they try to understand what are the important topics that are happening. Our horizon scanning program is an input into that. We do take reactive topics. Those can be ones that our implementation officers in discussions with our customers in the jurisdictions come up with, or anybody can submit that through our webpage, a topic that they feel is important. We then look to see if that broadly fits within the mandate of CADTH. We break that down to a short list, and then we do broad scoping and produce a topic brief that tries to encapsulate what is the topic, what broadly do we think the issues are around that. During that broad scoping, we do a lot of inputs from our stakeholders to try to refine that. And the intent of this is from that topic brief to decide how we will priority set. As you can imagine, we can't do every topic that comes to us. So we do have an internal priority setting process that depends on whether it meets the strategic goals of CADTH, aligns with kind of the major priorities of the healthcare system, if there is an unmet need, to decide how we priority set it. The issue that we have generally had is oftentimes when we do that priority setting, we have that topic brief, we still don't have a clear, defined decision problem. And part of that issue has been that, at the end of the day, our expertise is in evidence synthesis, and we apply research methods to evidence synthesis based on a research question. It is rare that in the healthcare system, what policymakers have or clinicians have is a research question. They have a problem, and many times if you actually ask them the problem, they won't be able to articulate it in a beautiful sentence. It's kind of a problem that in discussion with them, you will emerge through that discussion. And so this really was where we tried to focus our point of refinement, and we talked a great deal about this at last year's portfolio session. How can we have an environment where the stakeholders are put together in a room and for all intents and purposes is a focus group, that we're not asking them to give us an answer, but through each of their perspectives, discuss a topic, and our job is to listen. And so we listen to their discussion, we listen to it through a research lens, which is what my directorate has, that is our expertise, but we also have built up our internal capacity at CADTH on the policy side. So we have policy experts from CADTH who also sit and listen. And we try to see through their discussion what is the decision problem that seems to arise, and how can we apply our research methodologies to answer that. And so that decision problem arises, we then try to write it down and present it back to them to see if that's in fact what they were saying, and then we determine what components of our deliberative framework are going to drive that. So for example, it may be a decision problem where it's going to essentially be driven not by the efficacy of the technology or its safety or even its economics, but rather an implementation concern or an ethical concern. And if that's the case, then now we have the ability to put our efforts into truly developing a great evidence bundle in that particular aspect, because that's going to drive our decision. So our focus group for that's its intent is called a Device Advisory Committee. It has now actually been formed. It has had 2 meetings. The chair is Blair O'Neill. It consists of both jurisdictional members, academic members, and also expertise-based members. So members who have expertise in procurement, health professionals, and also we do have the chair of our patient and community committee sit on that, with the idea here that we have a vast, kind of broad spectrum of expertise, and through their discussion, we'll come up with what the decision problem is. So this is a bit of again, a simplified schema of how we're hoping that helps our process, that we've gone through this topic identification, we've gone through priority setting. The DAC then discusses this topic brief, we listen, and we determine what is the decision problem that they said and what components of our deliberative framework are needed to answer that. We then apply that to create a protocol, applying our research methods. We have our expert panel, HTERP, provide input into that. We have other stakeholder input, and then we feed it back to the DACT and our expert panel to say, this is what we heard, this is what we're planning to do. Will this answer the question that you think is going to drive this problem? And with our expert panel, are these the type of methods that will provide you the adequate amount of evidence so that you can make recommendations based on it? So I'll end there, and we'll kind of go into how this process has now operationalized and trying to now, if we've got the question right, how we tried to go about answering it.
Right. So as Harinder mentioned, once we have that question that's being refined, we then have to dive in and answer it in an appropriate way. So that answer that we provide is useful to those decision makers that are asking the question. And I'm going to be very brief because I think Harinder already talked a lot about what that sort of looks like. And so traditionally, historically, when we do a health technology assessment, we're looking at a number of different domains: the effectiveness, the cost effectiveness, patient perspectives, ethics, potentially legal and environmental. But it's not helpful for us to do a full clinical effectiveness review and spend that time and energy doing that if that's not the driver for the question. And so while DAC is helping us identify the drivers, we then have to turn that into questions that we can answer through our processes and adapt our processes to be more nimble in response to those different needs. So we do have some tools that we're developing in-house to help us identify which of these different domains may be required or not to answer a particular question, as well as what degree of rigor might be required. So like, do we need a full systematic review? Will a rapid review suffice? Is it not a review at all, but an environmental scan of current practice? And how do those different pieces fit together? So you've heard a little bit about that already with the condition level reviews, but now Leslie's going to walk through some specific examples of how we've listened to what DAC and our stakeholders have had to say and how we've turned those into sort of custom projects that aren't following our traditional roadmap of HTA and maybe selecting items from this list and putting them together in a way that will be more useful.
I'm going to go through 3 examples of how we have customized the reviews to ensure that we are getting the question right. So the first, and these 3 examples are at various stages of development, and the first one is actually a completed report. So this report and the statement that the committee developed is posted on the CADTH website. So the first example is a project that we conducted on dementia villages. This is a project that had questions about clinical effectiveness, but the literature is lacking in this area. So there are no studies on clinical effectiveness of dementia villages. However, our committee felt that there was still something there that they wanted to assess and develop a statement on. And we looked at what is the evidence, but also other considerations that jurisdictions may need to look at if they are looking at implementing something like dementia villages. So with the information that we produced, the Health Technology Expert Review Panel, or HTERP, was able to develop a position statement. So what we did was an assessment on existing information that has been published on dementia villages, as well as the different components of dementia villages. And we also did a policy analysis. So we've already mentioned the policy team at CADTH, and they were involved with developing the policy review for this report, looking at who should fund this, how should it be funded, should this be implemented, and some of those other considerations. So with the information that we developed, we were able to develop a statement. So HTERP did not develop a recommendation. We called this a position statement because it wasn't based on a traditional HTA, and we didn't have the clinical evidence or the other components for that. But they did feel like they had enough information to develop a statement that stated that dementia villages may have a place in care. for remote monitoring, another example, this is a project that is currently underway, and this is in early stages, but we have been doing some work on remote monitoring. So for this project, again, there wasn't a clinical driver. The main questions aren't about the clinical effectiveness of remote monitoring, it's more how it should be implemented. Some of the jurisdictions have already implemented remote monitoring, and this specific project is remote monitoring for cardiovascular conditions. So some jurisdictions have successfully implemented, and some are still grappling with how to implement. What are the different operational requirements? How is this feasible? What do we need to know to be able to successfully implement remote monitoring in the health system? So for this project, looking again at the different components that could be incorporated into an HTA, for this particular one, we are looking at effectiveness, but in this case, we're really doing rapid reviews to fill in any gaps in the evidence of clinical effectiveness. So it's not a full review for clinical effectiveness of remote monitoring. That's a bit broad. We're also doing qualitative reviews and consultations, as well as environmental scans, looking at patient and clinician experiences and perspectives for remote monitoring. And with that qualitative review, also looking at implementation considerations. So, and this is where learning from organizations who have successfully implemented remote monitoring will be particularly important for those jurisdictions who are still trying to decide how to do this and how best to implement. So looking at the different components that could possibly go into an HTA for this specific review, we'll be focusing on 3 areas that will customize to help decision makers with this specific question. The final example is e-consult, or another term for this is asynchronous telehealth. And this is a technology to help with referral, and it's physician to specialist referral. So the questions here, again, weren't necessarily about clinical effectiveness, and a lot of questions about implementation. So how do we successfully implement e-consult and these e-referral type systems? We're not focusing on a specific technology. This is e-consult in general and the technologies surrounding that. There were also questions about cost effectiveness. So is this actually saving the health system money? So if we are avoiding referrals using e-consult, then what does that mean for cost savings for the healthcare system? And does it affect the workflow? Does it affect patient care? So the questions surrounding e-consult, again, not focused on clinical effectiveness, but focused on other aspects. So for this project, again, we're not completing all of the elements from the deliberative framework or the components that could be incorporated into an HTA, and we're focusing on the areas that are seen to be drivers for this particular question. So again, a qualitative review for implementation considerations. And there is a project that has been wrapped up by Canadian Foundation for Healthcare Improvement on e-consult. This project looked at implementing e-consult in 11 sites, and we have been in discussions with CFHI about the information and the project that they completed, and hoping to learn from those 11 sites. So the 11 sites did successfully implement e-consult and are using it, but there are other jurisdictions who are still trying to decide how to implement this. So we'll continue those conversations with CFHI. And again, patient perspectives as well as clinician perspectives. So looking at the clinicians who have specifically implemented e-consult in their centers, what are their experiences, and with patients who have been referred through that system as well, and what are their experiences using that. We're also looking at conducting an economic analysis, and we're still figuring out what is possible with this. Time to referral is one of the outcomes from the e-consult studies. So there might be some work here that we can engage with others to determine what are the cost savings that might be possible using this type of system. So again, really tailoring the report for the type of information that would be needed for these types of decisions. So we've seen this diagram quite a bit today. Just emphasizing that we don't need to incorporate all of these elements if they aren't drivers for the specific decision problem that the jurisdictions are facing and that are being faced by the healthcare system. So we really want to focus on customizing this information to better meet the customer needs and really making sure we're getting the answer right.
Okay, so our last presentation on patient engagement before we engage with you and question and answer and some dialogue. Let me introduce Dr. Nicole Mittman. Nicole is the newest member of our executive team, came to us this summer from Cancer Care Ontario, and she's our chief scientist as well as she leads our evidence standards program, which includes a number of areas, and patient engagement is one of those key areas. So Nicole, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's interesting. I just wanted to follow up with Chris. I mean, the idea of not doing health technology assessment on timers for toothbrushes, I need them for the cord because I've lost the cord a number of times. Okay, so thanks very much for the opportunity. I just wanted to highlight some of the patient engagement activities that CADTH has been working with and planning. And so the first one I wanted to highlight was the formation of our Patient and Community Advisory Committee. And this was based on in the late fall of 2018, there was a listening opportunity for us to understand what are the needs of patients and community members. And we worked with 28 patient groups and internal and external CADTH individuals and committees, including the members of all of the patient and public members of the expert committees, to understand how to get patients and community and public groups more involved with CADTH and how do we actually leverage some of the expertise that we have out there. And so what we heard was that there was really a need for greater engagement and that there was a need for some of the engagement to have more diversity in the voices that we heard from, that we hear from folks who may have be represented, but we don't hear from anyone who may not be representative, for example. They wanted greater interaction, or we heard about greater interaction with the committees, and also about the governance and priorities around some of the work that CADTH does. And how do we measure the impact? And they were really interested in being supportive around some of the travel awards that we offer to patients and community members, and clear guidance on what is a bias or not biased. And then also thinking about how do we think about patient input and prepare for that. So as a result of that, we had, there were about 10,000 plus interest points available for a widely publicized request for patient and community members. Out of that, there were 85 formal applications. Out of those 85 formal applications, that listening exercise that I mentioned previously really formed the patient engagement team sort of workflow and also the terms of reference. And we had interviews with 24 individuals who actually then went through and we aligned them, blinded interviews with individuals who matched then our terms of reference. And we now have a committee of 12 individuals from various places and representation across the country, and also different patient and or public members from across the country that is diverse and is now representative of our Patient and Community Advisory Committee. And so this committee then will help advise how to strengthen our approach to dealing with the public and patients. It is not going to replace any currently existing committee, which we'll talk about in the upcoming slides. It'll provide advice on how to on transparency, particularly for CADTH processes, and also look at some of the priorities that we're looking at, and hopefully develop initiatives on appropriate use of drugs and devices across the life cycle approach as well. The advisory committee adds to CADTH's existing approaches, which are already indicated. We still have our public and patient members on the expert committees that we mentioned. We also then rely on patients and advocate and groups to provide input on patient input for whether there is a stakeholder engagement or reviews of devices, and then also consultations as well, and our scientific advice group that also looks to patients and or public members to provide context and opportunities for input on burden or other things that are important to the particular question at hand. And we still continue to rely on patients to contribute to the scientific advice, which is an opportunity that we have here at CADTH to look at the planning of clinical trials, for example. And we really are thankful for those individuals who provide their time and input to our program. And there are lots of different ways to be involved. As mentioned, we have the Patient and Community Now Advisory Committee, but we have our expert committees, and there are lots of groups, or not lots of different opportunities to be involved with our group. And we really look at this from the International Association of Public Participants, where they look at empowering and engaging with the public and patient community. So we follow their lead. As well as there's an opportunity to participate in the CADTH Symposium, so folks can attend in person and they can participate through either submitting abstracts, which I think the deadline's obviously closed, but providing presentations and posters, and so actively participating in the conference. But there's also an opportunity to participate in the planning committee and then also reviewing those many abstracts as part of the committee itself. We also have an application for travel awards for individuals, so that's deadline is December 10th, and the meeting is in Toronto in 2020. So individuals or groups who work with the CADTH teams, so examples are, we've already heard previously from the presentations before this one about medical devices and procedures to provide either input on health technology assessments or optimal use. In the horizon scanning, what are the differences or barriers or priorities or needs or the drivers, for example, that Leslie spoke about earlier, and then in the scientific advice program. And then we still have our committees there for the expert committee, whether it's the Common Drug Review or the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review process or others, for example, in CAR-T projects. And so here's our website, and this is if you'd like to learn more about patient engagement, you click on this lovely link, and then it gives you a little bit more information about all the opportunities, whether you're providing feedback, whether you're learning about what the Patient and Community Advisory Committee, or whether we're reaching out to stakeholders to understand the issues related to the disease in question. And I think that's it in terms of the 3 expert committees. I mentioned that in a previous slide. So this is the deliberative process. I think Brian alluded it. Sorry, I was looking for a natural break in the discussion of the patient engagement. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the deliberative processes, and Brian mentioned that earlier on. You understand we have 3 committees that are expert committees, and they all do things very similarly in terms of using what kind of elements that they use to actually look at what information do we need to understand the value of the new technology. The committees are 2 drug committees and then the device committee, which you saw that lovely picture that we've seen a few times with respect to what are the elements folks consider. But there are some similarities and there are some differences. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is understand a little bit around the deliberative processes and frameworks within each of the committees. And are there any opportunities there to organize them or learn from those committees? So to inform this work, we're interested in understanding opportunities for alignment. We have a number of different initiatives underway, and one of them is to do an internal review of the committees themselves and understand sort of the frameworks and the processes for those particular committees. Usually literature review and health technology assessment agencies that Brian indicated earlier on, looking at what are their best practices and what does the literature say in terms of review of common methods and or common elements or attributes that folks are including in the deliberative process. We're also participating in a study by the Center for Innovation in Regulatory Sciences, or CIRS, and they're looking at the quality of decision making, and I'll have some slides further on to talk a little bit about that. And as already mentioned, we're participating in the Health Technology Assessment International, the 2020 Global Policy Forum, which is actually on deliberative frameworks. So this is the CIRS group that's talking about the quality of decision making. They actually have a questionnaire for a number of health technology agencies who now are starting to look at the current, how the membership feels about the deliberative process, and then also how does the organization deal with the deliberative process. And so we're actually embarking on an analysis with them and understanding, collecting data with them. All the committees are participating. We had our first group, the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review Group, or PERC, actually participating with the first round of questionnaires, and we'll be doing the other two committees later on in early December. And so this is mentioned already previously, the Health Technology International Global Policy Forum, and this is where we're thinking about how other health technology agencies use their best practices and how do they deliberate as well. We anticipate the following timelines that we're in the process, and currently, as mentioned, we're doing the work with the CIRS group. The Health Technology Assessment Forum will happen in January 2020, and there'll be some completion of literature reviews and discussions with external organizations over the next little while, and we hope to have some recommendations about the understanding the deliberative process more fulsomely by April 2020. And this is just the CIRS group. This is their mission for those folks who don't know about this. And it's projected hopefully better than it is I can see on my comfort screen here. But it is their mission is to look at regulatory practices from a quality point of view, and then now expanding for health technology practices as well. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, so we've gotten through all of the presentations, and now it's over to you, your opportunity to ask questions. Once again, for those of you who are watching the live stream feed, you can use the look on your toolbar, and there's a question feature there, so you can send your questions in. And somebody has already done that. We have one question, but I'm also looking to you in the room. Please come up to the microphone. We do have a first person. So let's start with the one online here first. So the question is, are you collecting any information on home health monitoring events or activities that have occurred in some provinces, and any documentation such as white papers? From Patty Wixon in Alberta Health Services. So Leslie, perhaps?
We do have some environmental scans underway, one on remote monitoring, which is actually just in development that I had mentioned previously. And we're also looking at a few other projects on different home monitoring technologies. So it's too early for me to know what those specific questions are, but I'll take that back and confirm it with the team. And if that is something that is of relevance that we should be collecting, then that certainly is something that we would incorporate into the survey.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. So let's go to question in the room. Again, name and company.
Yeah, good morning. This is Max from Johnson & Johnson Medical Device Companies. As usual, I have several questions, but I'll stick to one for now, and then we'll see if I come back. And I thought I will start with Chris and digital solutions. And I was wondering whether you're coming up with a new framework to assess or quantify the value of these technologies. I'm thinking of ease of use being very important in the adoption of those technologies, yet it's very hard to quantify, and when you're going to compare different solutions, as well as, for example, if a physician is able to access more information, and that the use of the information is very operator specific, yet there is a lot of value in that, and there's going to be a lot of solutions for that. So how are you thinking of assessing? Are you looking into a different framework to assess these solutions?
So thanks for the question. That's a really good question. I think right now we're still at the stage of looking at frameworks for the evaluation component, not necessarily what value it brings. I think, there are a number of challenges. One is that digital health is not a monolith, and there are a number of different technologies, so those may have different value propositions depending on what the technology is, an app versus an AI interface that's integrated with an MRI, for example. I also think that the value probably, as you say, like it depends on the user and what value they place on some of those components. So my answer is that we have not yet. We may, but I'm not sure that it's our team where that solution lies.
I can add a little bit to that. It's clear in many areas we need to collaborate with other groups that have expertise in some of these areas that we don't. And so we have expertise in evidence synthesis for clinical effectiveness and other components that we mentioned. And especially in the digital space, things such as privacy, cybersecurity are areas that are critically important, but it doesn't require that we have that expertise in isolation, but rather we can collaborate with other groups that have that. And usability, I'm not sure where that fits into. Is it fit into, because clearly has a close relationship to clinical effectiveness, and there are frameworks for digital health clinical effectiveness that other groups have developed that we're looking at, but how usability links into that, or is it more similar on the kind of cybersecurity, that realm of things? And those are some of the thinkings that we're still trying to work through.
Thank you. I did have somebody that used LinkedIn to join up with me, connect with me, but just said thank you for leading the CADTH Medical Devices Information Session. Very informative. No question, though. But we do have one from Claudine Marceau from Teva Pharmaceuticals, and it's probably related to the condition level reviews, Leslie. So it is any framework plan for evaluation beyond mental health. For example, respiratory diseases, knowing that adherence is a recurrent problem.
We don't have any respiratory diseases currently on our list, but good to know that that might be a potential issue. We've talked about adherence support for other conditions, so there might be some transferability there. So for respiratory conditions, we've looked a little bit at exploring topics for remote monitoring for respiratory conditions, but we don't have anything underway. But this is certainly something that we'll go back and look at our long list of topics that Harindra had mentioned to see what is on there. And adherence support is certainly something that keeps coming up in a lot of the questions that we do get on some of the topics that are underway. So, and this spans digital health a little bit as well with different technologies for adherence support. So there might be something here that we've talked a little bit about foundation reviews, and this is very early on in our thinking, but when we're doing technology and when we're doing reviews such as some of these larger reports, some of the components are very similar across the reports, things like travel to different locations. So adherence support, because it comes up quite frequently, this might be something that would be conducive to one of those foundational reviews that could span multiple technologies and multiple conditions. So thank you for your question.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. And to Claudine, we'll probably get into that a little bit this afternoon in the pharmaceutical portfolio session. Some of the products we have in our pharmaceutical review would be going beyond the reviews we do on an individual drug into a therapeutic class review. Some of the things that are of particular importance to jurisdictions and their ability to manage budgets is the budget impact of therapies, and now they're specifically looking at the cumulative budget impact of treating a disease and all of the patients that have that disease. And in many areas in respiratory diseases, there are some really interesting new innovative technologies coming our way, but also some interesting diagnostic approaches. So cystic fibrosis, for example, an area of great interest because of a lot of new treatments and therapies associated with it there. So it could be a potential condition level review as well. So let's go back to the room.
Chun Long, I'm from Edwards Life Sciences. I have a question for Leslie regarding the conditional level reviews. What criteria do you use to select your topics, and how many you plan to do in a year, for example? And also, in terms of expert input, do you use the current expert review committees or focus groups you mentioned that would that replace the expert committee's input?
Thanks, Trin. So for the criteria, we've currently worked with our implementation support team For the first condition level reviews, we wanted to look at feasibility and what were the current hot topics in jurisdictions that people had issues with, current priorities in the jurisdictions. So right now, we've selected the topics based on what was feasible. As this is a new product type with CADTH, we selected a topic that we will work and refine through the process as we go. So for future condition level reviews, we'll be refining that criteria. So it would be similar to our typical topic prioritization criteria, looking at the clinical impact, economic impact, population, and so forth, but we're also looking at feasibility as well. So I know mental health is a topic that we want to explore with a condition level review, but because of the broad nature of that topic and some of the challenges, how feasible is that? So we need to make sure that is something that we can successfully do. That was your first question. For numbers, we are initiating one condition level review this year. So we've initiated the TB project and hoping to wrap that up this fiscal year or shortly after. And we don't have targets or projections for condition level reviews now, but it would fall under our strategic objectives for our business projections for health technology assessments and optimal use, which I believe are up to 25 per year, 14 to 25 a year. Ish. So that
I
will
always
fit into
push
that
for
bucket.
the larger number, of course.
Up to 25. And for experts, for the first condition level review, we are working closely with the implementation support team who have been reaching out to clinical experts and different experts in the jurisdictions. That's who we're meeting with now to explore the topic and what are the gaps and that they are hoping for us to assess. So with that implementation support team, we've made those linkages and we hope to engage with some of those experts to see through the entire project. The first condition level review, we have currently explored the topic with both the advisory committee, DAC, and the expert committee. So Devices Advisory Committee has provided their input and advice onto the topic. And with the Health Technology Expert Review Panel, as of now, we don't have plans to develop a recommendation statement for the condition level reviews. We do hope to have a dedicated page on the website for this condition level review that will hopefully drill down to the different levels of information that is required. But at this point, we don't have plans to develop a recommendation based on that information, but we will engage experts throughout the process as we do for our other HTAs and optimal use projects.
Perfect, thank you. So let's go online again here. A question from Judith Glennie for you, Nicole. What opportunity will be given to stakeholders to provide input to the review of deliberative frameworks?
Thanks very much for that question, Judy. So as mentioned, our plan is to have some recommendations by end of April or beginning of April in 2020, which will then be followed by stakeholder consultation and feedback and input.
And so lots of opportunities there. We're also looking at, from a transparency perspective, just the ability to open up our expert committee meetings to be a little more publicly open. So trying to create opportunities for industry, for patients, and clinicians to actually participate in aspects of the expert committee meetings. And we've had some discussions with the chairs of the committees. All are open to it, as long as they still have an opportunity for a closed session, a deliberative session as well. So our next question is on digital tech. Oh, no, let's go. We have one in the room. Yes, sorry. Go ahead.
Hi there. Luigi Formica from Canopy Growth. My question was around the evaluation of medical devices, in particular that data packages are maybe not as comprehensive as CADTH has once seen with, say, the pharmaceutical side of things. The level of uncertainty might be a little bit higher. Has CADTH thought about helping facilitate coverage with evidence base, knowing that we don't have as much evidence as, say, a pharmaceutical, so to allow coverage but help facilitate that evidence generation?
So great question, and one that everybody in the medical device space confronts the fact that we have more immature data, and the time taken to get more mature data will often be less relevant data because it will be with a device that has iterated. Our approach to this has been to really emphasize the need for us articulating the amount of uncertainty in the recommendations that we need and the need for reassessment. And so some of the, actually quite a number of the recommendations that our expert panel has put out in the last year have actually explicitly stated the need for reassessment. And so although we don't, it falls outside of our mandate to recommend something as definitive as coverage with evidence development, it rather is an acknowledgement of where there is uncertainty, to specify where it is, and the need for reassessment such that if it is adopted, that data be collected in particular areas to address that uncertainty.
It certainly is part of the concept that we have with health technology management to look at technologies over their life cycle. And to do that, you need to have good information or share information in the pre-market space, do that on-market assessment. And as you said, even in the pharmaceutical space, there's so much uncertainty when that product is given market authorization, but particularly so in the medical devices space. So trying to collect data in the post-market space, giving conditional market authorization and reimbursement, conditional reimbursement as well, will be a big part of that, and then trying to do that reassessment.
I guess the reason why I ask is the primer was that earlier slide that you'd put up about the idea of taking recommendation and following it through to implementation. We often notice that it kind of falls, there's either, whether it's a recommendation, a soft recommendation, whatever we want to say, whether it be from a rapid review or other products, that it kind of falls there, and then it's kind of everyone hides behind the idea of like more evidence is needed to be generated, and then we don't have an opportunity to do that. So it'd be wonderful if CADTH could help kind of bridge that gap with provinces, because we know that falls outside of your jurisdiction completely, but help bridge that gap, and maybe that allows you to kind of hit that mandate on following it through to implementation.
Great points. I mean, I can highlight a few areas that we've tried to work on that. So certainly our implementation support component of the organization is one that has had tremendous growth over the last few years, with the idea there of to really bridge that gap of where recommendations end on paper to how to implement that. We've done a fair amount of work with our regulatory partners also with Health Canada on looking at particular types of areas. We mentioned 3D printing as one of them, but the entire advanced therapeutics pathway that Health Canada has announced is meant to kind of hone in on those technologies for which there will be a lot of uncertainty, that have different types of regulatory frameworks that the current ones don't necessarily fit with, and that there will be lots of uncertainty in the type of evidence developed. And I take it as a very positive sign that throughout that entire process, as they're developing that HTA bodies such as ours are key parts of that, so that the data being collected for regulatory decisions is not distinct from the data being collected for HTA decisions for the technologies that are going to need that.
Thanks very much.
And Nicole, did you want to mention a little bit about real-world evidence collection as well?
Yeah, thanks very much. And just to add on to what Harinder and Brian indicated, we are working with Health Canada in the pre- and post-regulatory space on understanding real-world data and real-world evidence, and what kind of information should we be collecting, and in what format, and what methods, and what outcomes. And as you can imagine, across all the devices and all the drugs, we're talking about very different outcomes. So we're thinking about frameworks or what kind of methods are important to collect. And so for those of you who are as old as I am and have remembered that, you know, real-world data and real-world evidence used to be called pharmacovigilance, right, or vigilance and post-marketing sort of surveillance. And so this is an extension about, could we start to generate evidence in the post-approval space to then help validate or improve or, I guess, improve the types of data that's available.
Okay, an interesting question here from Alberta Health Services, Tanya Washko, probably to you, Chris, on digital technologies. With respect to assessment of digital technologies, do you envision collaborating with international groups in the future to be more responsive to the advancements or improvements? And also, digital health sees no borders.
So I would say yes. We've already been engaged in conversations with international partners. I mentioned earlier in the UK, the National Health Service. We've had conversations with them about how they are approaching apps. That was the context that we were discussing. So certainly I think there is room for that type of international collaboration. If you go to any of the international meetings that have been mentioned, digital health and the challenges in assessing them, including the volume of technologies, is a pressing issue for all stakeholders and all assessing agencies in that space. So certainly I think there is room for that. And what was the second part of the question?
Just that digital health sees no borders.
Yes, so I mean, it does see no borders. That's actually been a challenge that we've seen in some of the assessments that we've already had. So for example, with the internet-based cognitive behavioral therapy, one thing that the panel discussed was the fact that your caregiver may be licensed in a different province than the province that you're receiving care. So that's certainly an implementation consideration and a challenge to consider for digital health. It wasn't something that we that was factored into the recommendation per se. It's a consideration for rollout, but not something that would necessarily, in that case, cause us to recommend for or against. Just something that needs to be considered. So certainly the cross-border nature, it's not just interprovincial. It could be caregivers in the United States providing care in Canada through sort of that borderless world that would need to be considered. That is more of a regulatory space than HTA, I think.
This is a broader question about international collaboration. We're well connected through a number of the international networks and NATA with the 50 agencies across the world, and lots of opportunities there to share information on medical devices, clinical interventions. We have what's referred to as our listserv, where any one of those 50 agencies can submit a question, an open question, to all of the agencies, and then that agency will gather the information and share it publicly. I've also had recent conversations about creating a bit of an HTA block with some like-minded countries that use a similar framework that we use. And I've received some good traction from 6 countries in particular, more kind of Commonwealth countries. And we hope to proceed with that over the next, say, 6 to 12 months as well. So a question here from Julian Nam from Roche, I presume Roche Diagnostics. Is there any discussion on the role of the device review programs to support implementation of companion diagnostics? And more importantly, of diagnostic testing that is not exclusive to any one biomarker or test, for example, NGS. Narendra, do you want to? Diagnostic space.
I'm not entirely sure how to answer that. So in the companion diagnostics, certainly that has been something that has stayed within the pharmaceutical space, and certainly a fair amount of work has been done, and Nicole can comment on some of that on the economic evaluations of how we're going to incorporate that into our reviews. Diagnostics that have been self-standing have kind of felt within our area, but there really hasn't been a lot of discussion about moving that for the ones that are companion per se.
Nicole, on the next generation sequencing, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, to answer Harindra's first question, I mean, we have been working on guidelines to how to incorporate and what kind of methods are required to conduct economic evaluations on companion diagnostic products. And we've been working with other groups on that to try and align that kind of work. Yeah, from a next generation sequencing point of view, I mean, we've talked about it in the pharmaceutical space and how to deal with, for example, drugs that have multiple or agents that have one marker and then but yet have multiple disease states, for example, and or entities. So I think that there are new and novel ways to manage it and think about it, and so it's certainly on our agenda from an evidence standards point of view to think about.
And it has been mostly dealt with in our pharmaceutical space. Many of the new cancer drugs that come to us also come with a companion diagnostics. It becomes a bit of a challenge when it is 2 different companies, a diagnostic company and a drug company that are marketing this, again, because of some of the connectivity from the economic standpoint. Many of these companion diagnostics have a significant price associated with them as well. And in the next generation sequencing and the more broader sequencing area, again, some of the costs associated with doing the testing, and then some concerns about overdiagnosis and overtreatment with some of the testing as well. So it is an area of increased interest. Okay, we have a question in the room.
Manuel Young from the Public Health Agency of Canada. You were talking a lot about incorporating elements of the deliberative framework into these customizable HTAs. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on some of the tools or the typical questions that you're asking in order to decide what elements to incorporate and the rigor of those planned analyses?
It's a great question. So we haven't decided yet. So I will describe kind of where our thinking is, and then others can jump in. It would be wonderful if we just had a simple checklist that we decide on the decision problem, we look at the checklist, we tick off things, and we can feel very confident that we can eliminate one part of the deliberative framework or not. It's pretty clear that that's not going to be the case. And so we are well aware that we're going to have some missteps of leaving out a component when we initially start the protocol, and then as it goes through the process of discussion with our expert panels, we'll realize that that was a mistake and we have to add it in. That being said, the alternative of keeping everything in the fear of making a misstep along the way really limits our ability to be timely. So generally how we're thinking right now is we're doing a lot of listening to what the Device Advisory Committee, through their discussions, have about a particular topic. And I will say that once the Device Advisory Committee got to the point where they didn't feel that they actually had to give us an answer, they just had to talk about a topic, they've really embraced that in the 2 meetings that they've had. They talk a lot. And through those discussions, it actually becomes fairly apparent whether there is really a strong kind of ethical component to this that's going to drive it, whether it be a question of equity of access, where there is a real concern about is this actually work? Or is it just a slam dunk? There's no doubt that the efficacy of this is established. Is a real concern about the cost. So we kind of listen to whether those things are coming up. And we can then broadly say of the 7 things or 8 things in our deliberative framework, 1 or 2 really wasn't mentioned at all. And on those others, the next layer, if we've decided that it's going to be involved, is kind of the depth that we would go in. So it will be I would love if we ever got to the point where we would do an HTA where we didn't have an efficacy component at all, because that would mean that this is truly working. I don't think any of us are going to be quite so brave anytime soon. But if it really isn't driving it, well then we could, if there's a published systematic review, we put that up there and that's it. Done relatively quickly, and we can put our efforts into that other area. So it's this kind of idea of this matrix of which component is necessary based on that discussion, and we will have a bit of a checklist to allow us, because there are going to be certain things that we are really going to be concerned about leaving out. So almost everything has an ethical component to it. So will we ever feel confident enough to say this one has none? I don't know. So we do want to have some guidelines around that so we can make some decisions, and then the depth of how far we're going to go within each one. So that kind of matrix is the general approach that we're taking, but it's still early and we haven't yet put kind of even broad categories of how to decide to help steer us in the right direction. Leslie, Chris, do you guys want to add on to that?
Once a topic is prioritized, then we go into our detailed scoping process, and we're working very closely with our evidence standards team and our health economics team and our clinical team and all of the teams involved with the different components to really go through each of the components to determine what might be needed and what might not, and mapping that to what the decision problem is from the jurisdiction. So by doing that process, then getting into how would we then address each of those questions. So the evidence standards team has been working very closely with us to help develop that criteria and how to assess when a rapid review would be enough, or when do we need a full systematic review, or when do we need an implementation analysis or not? Similar to environmental components, a lot of technologies don't have one, but there are some really obvious technologies that do have an environmental component. So a lot of it is this conversation between the teams who will be involved with the review to determine which components would be required to address that specific question.
I'll just add, so as Harinder said, it's still in development, and it's not intended to be a checklist. It's intended to be a guide for conversation amongst the team to help make decisions around that. The environmental example is a good one. We've made decisions where we've included that chapter in our HTA, and we've made decisions where it has not been included. And really the goal is to guide us through that conversation so we can be transparent about that decision-making process. So the topic briefs are intended to be eventually posted on our website to help elucidate what that decision-making was, and how we landed on including or not including a component.
And maybe go ahead.
I was just going to say the three examples we chose to highlight were really meant to kind of display that we're trying hard to follow through on this, that the dementia villages, the e-consults, and the cardiac remote monitoring don't look like a regular HTA. Those don't look like HTAs that you would have expected us to produce 5 years ago. And our hope is that it will still meet the needs and answer the questions that our customers have.
And maybe just to add, I mean, that's part of the deliberative process and review that we're undergoing, is that flower diagram that you saw with the elements that are currently included with respect to the review and the deliberation and things that are of priority and drivers. There's a larger diagram, flower diagram from Lou Garrison and Peter Newman that has many more elements included. And then there was a publication in the early 2000s that had 50 plus different attributes that you could start to consider. So part of it is to say, well, what do we need to consider as part of this? What's within our mandate? And then other kinds of elements that we may want to, or attributes that we might want to add to our process, or perhaps figure out ways how to add or not add to our process, for example.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left of questions, and this one probably you, Leslie, and it's a long question, so pay attention. So from Alberta Health Services again, Frederick Kundicht. Interesting, we've had lots of questions from Alberta, none from Manitoba. I think may have been a little bit of celebration from our friends in Manitoba with the Grey Cup win of their team last night. So CADTH prepared a report in 2015 about single-use medical devices reprocessing for reuse. We've done a number of reports on that, in fact. Has CADTH or MedTech Canada, or any experts on the panel come across concerns about labeling of single-use medical devices? For example, nasal cannula, Yankauer suction, oxygen mask, suction containers are all labeled single-use. The patient uses and reuses these devices. However, single-use devices are described as those meant to be used once for a single procedure and then discarded. Has there been discussion at the manufacturer's level regarding supplying more information on the label to actually explain the intended use? IV sets are also single use and to be discarded after use, but what constitutes a use? These sets are often changed on a regularly scheduled basis. Is there information on the label saying how long they can be safely used? Leslie, and anybody from the manufacturer? Okay, well, go ahead, Leslie, first.
Get Raj up here.
And then Raj.
So, yes, we did some work in the past on single-use devices, but didn't specifically touch on this element for those single-use devices that are truly single-use, and how patients reuse them. And we don't have currently anything underway on this question for labeling requirements. I believe that would not be a CADTH question, and there might be others who, with Health Canada, who may be able to address that part of the question. But as for CADTH, we don't currently have anything underway on this, but if there are questions that are still coming up on the labeling and issues with single-use medical devices, then we've obviously done the work in the past and would be happy to take this on as additional work if there were those questions in the jurisdictions.
So, Raj Malik with MedTech Canada. I would agree with Leslie's comments. There was a report that came out in 2016 from Health Canada regarding the reprocessing of single-use devices, and I don't believe that it required any additional labeling from manufacturers. And since that time, I've not heard anything from manufacturers or from other stakeholders regarding additional product information that's listed on labels. So while I'm up here, can I ask another question?
Please do. Yeah.
Thank you. So my question goes back to the concept of collaboration. And Brian, you mentioned that there is international collaboration that's happening with CADTH, which is great to hear. I think you also mentioned that there were a number of HTA organizations in Canada, and I wonder if you could just comment on the collaboration efforts that you've had with some of those organizations. I know, as an example, that there's been a collaboration between CADTH and OTAC/HQO, and just wondering what the plans were to do additional collaborations to try and improve the efficiencies of HTA organizations and their efforts in Canada.
Yeah, thanks for that, Raj. Very timely. This will likely be our last question as well, and I'll get Harendra to speak to some of the specifics of what we are engaging. Similarly, globally, we do want to kind of share the wealth of expertise just based on the volume and the breadth and the scope of the different devices and interventions that are out there. In Canada, we saw this need as well with some of the provincial bodies. So a number of years ago, I reached out to them, and we have created this Pan-Canadian Health Technology Assessment Collaborative with INES from Quebec, Health Quality Ontario, with the Institute of Health Economics in Alberta, and the BC Health Technology Review Program as well. So we have a steering committee of the CEOs of each of these organizations, good commitment from each of those organizations. We wanted to go, again, beyond just having conversations about really sharing, developing a common agenda for all of Canada, and then sharing the distribution and the products development from there. So from that, Harendra and his team have now worked with the operators within each of these organizations to try and move this forward, and we want to look at expanding this collaborative to other bodies as well. So Harendra, perhaps if you wanted to speak to this.
Sure. So it's a great question, and I could probably spend half an hour answering it because it really, I would say, has been one of the highlights of working at CADTH has been building up this Pan-Canadian collaborative. So tangibly, it consists of 5 members currently. We share all the topics that we have under consideration. The intent of that is twofold. First, there are often very common priorities among the different jurisdictions and us as a national body. And we want to ensure, first, that we're not duplicating each other's work. Second, that we are informing each other's work when there is work that is topics that are shared. And finally, and we're just moving into this realm, if there is a topic that's particularly important in one jurisdiction, it should be important in those other jurisdictions. We have similar kind of priorities oftentimes with some subtle differences. And so this topic sharing, we in fact have now refined that to simply, during the meetings, discussing lists, to a common database where we actually input these so that it's more comprehensive. We do collaborative projects. So the ones that we've done the most with have been with HQO, where in fact the teams share the work. So there's components done by one agency, components done by the other agency. Another way that we have done that has been with INES, where we keep each other, when we do have to do the projects separately as far as the teams, we keep each really well informed about progress, conclusions, and timelines so that there's no surprises. Our intent is to continue to do those types of collaborative projects, and in fact, we do have a mechanism by which, and we have done this already, where some of the money that we received in additional funding from Health Canada for the health technology management, part of that intent was to have this network of HTA producers, and so we are actually providing funding for that. Another very tangible aspect is we do have a staff person that works for CADTH and HQO, is Elizabeth, who is in the back room, who is really, she's an implementation support officer who works for us and HQO, again, with that intent of that kind of more than just words, action. I'll comment on 2 other things. and I won't take half an hour to do it. So we are cognizant that having a name called the Pan-Canadian HTA Collaborative, its intent is to be pan-Canadian. And so one of the important initiatives that Leslie ran was to actually understand who self-identifies as an HTA body. And we were very open in that definition. It could be groups that come up with topics. It could be groups that do HTAs. We weren't going to pre-specify that. And I want to say 43. Is that right? 44. I keep adding and taking away from this. But anyway, that's a pretty big number. That's a lot of groups that are doing HTAs. And so we identified them, we engage with them. There will be a living map, if it's not up there yet on the web page when this report comes up, that we intend to be a living document to update as new groups come in to understand what their expertise is. And the final step is to expand the collaborative. Now, going from 5 to 45 in one step will result in us losing all of the kind of nimbleness that we have. So we've put a lot of thought into the terms of reference and a structure and charter for how we can expand, and the kind of overlying sentiment among all the current members is that of being inclusive. We want to engage everybody because there's often been a statement that HTAs in the medical device space does not have capacity. Well, we now know that's not true. We do. There are 44 groups in this country that can do this work. We just need to be able to better organize ourselves so that the work is done across this entire network.
Thank you. We're going to have to now wrap up. So just one quick reminder for you. Our 2020 CADTH Symposium will be held in Toronto for the first time. We're expecting a large number of attendees this year. We'll probably hit the 1,000 mark or more. And our theme is decision making in an era of, or in an age of uncertainty. Very important topic to all of us. So please look up for the details to attend. So for those of you who participated in this today by live stream, thank you very much for your interest in CADTH, and for those of you in the room as well, thank you for coming and for hopefully learning a bit more about our very important medical devices and clinical interventions program. Thank you all.